The men who built her never wrote down how they did it. No blueprints survived, no engineering manuals, no formal calculations. Just a forest standing on Monday and a hole taking shape by Friday, shaped by hands that had learned by watching hands that had learned by watching hands. And what those hands built was staggering. A single large clipper ship contained more precisely fitted timber than most cathedral frames of the same era. Thousands of individual pieces, each one cut and shaped by eye and chisel, to tolerances that wouldn't forgive a mistake. Because a mistake 300 miles into the Atlantic wasn't a mistake you walked away from. These weren't small boats. They were floating cities, longer than a city block, carrying the weight of continents in their holds, driven through the worst water on Earth by nothing but wind and wood and the accumulated knowledge of men whose names almost nobody remembers. So how did they do it? How was something this large and this precise actually built, without a single machine that runs on anything but muscle? That's what we're here to find out. The answer starts before a single axe swings. It starts in the forest, and not just any part of the forest. A master shipwright didn't walk in and take the straightest trees. He walked in looking for the wrong ones, the bent ones, the twisted ones, the oaks that had spent a century growing sideways around a boulder or reaching toward a gap in the canopy, their grain following every curve they'd made. Because a ship isn't built from straight lines. A ship is an organism of curves, ribs that arc, knees that angle, braces that sweep. And every one of those curves, if you cut it from straight timber and shaped it against the grain, would eventually split under load. The sea finds weakness. It always does. So the timber had to be found already curved, the grain running true through the bend, grown that way over generations. The builders called it compass timber, and hunting it was a skill unto itself. A knee timber, the joint connecting a ship's horizontal deck beams to its vertical frames, had to match the ship's plans so precisely that experienced men would walk forests for weeks, sometimes covering miles of ground, searching for a single oak with exactly the right angle. One joint, weeks of searching. That specificity was the craft, not measurement, not calculation. A trained eye moving through trees, reading growth the way a musician reads a score. And that raises something harder. If this knowledge lived entirely in the bodies and eyes of the men who held it, what else did they know that we've already lost? That question, what else did they know that we've lost, becomes almost unbearable once you step inside the yard itself. Because the forest was only the beginning. What happened next was something the Industrial Revolution would later claim to have invented: a system. A choreographed, interlocking system of specialized labor, running at scale, decades before the factory became the dominant model of human production. A large yard employed over 1,000 men, but not 1,000 men doing the same thing. Hewers who rough-shaped green timber with broad axes, taking off pounds of wood per stroke with a precision that looked reckless until you measured the result. Sawyers working in pits, one man above the log, one below, pulling a long blade through hardwood all day, in a rhythm that could only be sustained by two people who knew each other's bodies. Caulkers who drove oakum into every seam with mallets and a rolling percussive thunder that you could hear from half a mile away. Fasteners, drillers, joiners, plank benders, pitch boilers, riggers, each trade a world unto itself, each craftsman who almost never crossed into another man's work, and somehow, without blueprints that most of them could read, without project management or Gantt charts or any of the coordination tools we assume are necessary for complexity at scale, hundreds of specialists landed their work in the right place at the right time. How? The answer is stranger than you'd expect, and it lived in something even harder to recover than compass timber. The answer lived in the keel, not as a metaphor, as a literal fact. Before a single rib rose, before a single plank was bent, before any of those hundred specialists touched their tools, a master shipwright walked a cleared building slip and made one decision that could not be undone. He set the keel. A long ship's keel wasn't one timber. It was a series of massive oak sections, scarfed together, their joints cut at long diagonal angles and bolted through, so the whole assembly acted as one continuous beam. For a large clipper, that beam ran over 200 feet, and it had to be set within fractions of an inch of level, not approximately, not close enough. Fractions of an inch over 200 feet of length on a timber foundation that would never be touched again once the frames went up. Because if the keel wasn't true, nothing above it could be. A ship that sat twisted at the spine would never sail straight, would never answer the rudder cleanly, would work her seams open in heavy seas. The keel was the commitment. Every measurement in the entire ship cascaded from it. Which raises the question those hundreds of specialists somehow answered every day. How do you build perfectly upward from a foundation you cannot move or correct? The answer started with the frames. Once the keel was set and locked, immovable, committed, the shipwright's next task was to build the skeleton upward from it. And that skeleton was nothing like what most people picture when they imagine a rib. A single frame wasn't carved from one timber. No tree grew the precise compound curve a hull frame required, the right bend at the right angle, tapering correctly from keel to rail. So each frame was a composite. Several curved sections of oak, each harvested specifically for its natural shape, were scarfed together into one continuous rib. And here's the detail that reveals how seriously these builders thought about failure. Those scarf joints, every one of them a potential weakness, had to be staggered. No two joints on adjacent timbers could land at the same height. Stack weaknesses on top of each other and the frame fails as a unit. Offset them and each timber's strength covers its neighbor's seam. Dozens of these composite frames were raised along the keel, spaced precisely, each one locked into its seat. The mortise cut into the keel itself. The whole shape emerged not from a single plan but from the cumulative judgment of every joint, every curve, every spacing decision made by hand. Which brings the harder problem into focus. These frames had to carry not just their own weight, but the dynamic stress of a living ship, a structure that flexed, twisted and pounded through North Atlantic winters. Where would stress concentrate? Where would the hull want to fail? Those were not questions anyone could answer with a test. The ship wouldn't meet open ocean until it was already built. And stress concentration was exactly the problem waiting on the other side of the frames. Because the frames only held if the planks binding them together could be made to curve. Not gently. The hull's bilge, the deep rounded shoulder where the sides swept down to the bottom, demanded bends that flat-grown timber simply refused to make. A plank 2 inches thick and the width of a man's hand would sooner split down the grain than follow that curve cold. So builders made it follow another way. Steam. Steam boxes were long wooden chests fed by a boiler. Crude, effective, brutal. A plank went in stiff as a barn beam and came out something closer to leather. But the window was short, maybe 10 minutes before the fibers cooled and the wood remembered its original shape. In that window, a crew had to haul the plank out, carry it at a run to the hull, clamp one end, and lever the rest around the bilge curve, while it was still giving. A job measured in minutes. Some planks made it, some cracked at the tightest point, a sound like a rifle shot, and had to be scrapped. How often did that happen? More than the finished ships suggest. The yards absorbed the failures quietly. Split planks, rejected timbers, recalculated curves. The waste was built into the estimate before the keel was even laid. What the builders could not absorb was a miscalculation in the frames underneath, because if the skeleton was wrong, no amount of steam would make the skin fit right. So the skeleton had to be right, and the skin had to fit. But even a perfect hull, every frame true, every plank bent and fastened exactly as drawn, was still, technically, a sieve. Wood is not watertight. The gaps between planks, however tight they looked, would pass water the moment the ship met any sea worth naming. Sealing those gaps was its own trade entirely, and the men who did it had a title, caulkers. Their raw material was oakum, hemp rope, unpicked and twisted into loose fiber, and they drove it into every seam with iron irons and mallets, forcing the fiber deep into the joint until it compressed against itself and held. Then hot pine pitch went over the top, poured and worked in while still liquid, cooling to a hard seal flush with the hull. On a large ship, those seams didn't add up to feet or yards, they added up to miles. A caulking gang working a big frigate or a merchant clipper was there for weeks. The sound carried mallet after mallet, iron after iron, a continuous mechanical thunder that was said to be audible a full mile from the yard. You knew a ship was near ready by the noise. Which raises the harder question. A hull built from wood and rope and pine pitch launched into the North Atlantic. Water that in winter sits just above freezing, that can run 20-foot swells for days without break. How did it stay tight? Not just for one crossing, but for years. The answer starts with the men who understood wood the way a doctor understands a body. not from textbooks, but from years of handling it, reading it, knowing where it would give and where it would hold. Master shipwrights carried their entire engineering system inside their heads. No differential equations, no stress calculations on paper. Rules of thumb, absorbed through apprenticeship, refined across decades, passed from a master's hands to a boy's eyes before the boy could properly name what he was learning. Here's the detail that stops most people cold. The majority of master shipwrights in the early 19th century could not read formal architectural drawings. A modern naval architect works from precise drafted plans, lines, curves, dimensions rendered on paper to a fraction of an inch. These men worked from a half model, a carved wooden hull, sometimes no bigger than a shoebox, shaped by hand until it felt right. Every dimension of the finished ship was scaled up from that carving. The ratio lived in the builder's eye and his calipers, not on any page. And yet the ships held. Oak swells when it gets wet. The fibers expand, pressing the caulked seams tighter, the hull becoming more watertight under the very conditions that threatened to destroy it. The wood was doing the engineering, which means the men who chose it, cut it, fitted it, and caulked it, had to understand that behavior so deeply they could anticipate it years before the ship ever touched water. That knowledge lived in people, which raises the harder question: how did something this sophisticated survive across generations? And what happened when it didn't? That knowledge survived the way all dangerous knowledge survives: person to person, hand over hand, failure to failure. An apprentice didn't read about how oak moves. He watched a timber crack because someone got it wrong, and he remembered. The craft passed through bodies, not books, which is exactly why it was so fragile. One generation that didn't teach, one yard that burned, one war that pulled the journeyman away, and decades of accumulated understanding could simply stop existing. There are shipyards whose particular methods vanished so completely that later historians couldn't reconstruct them from the physical ships left behind. The hull was there. The knowledge that made it wasn't. And here's what makes that loss sting harder. The builders who came closest to mastering wood were also the ones discovering, in real time, that wood had a ceiling. The longest wooden ships ever attempted, some stretching past 300 feet, began to fail in a way no amount of skill could fully cure. They hogged. The hull would arch at the middle and sag at the ends, the whole structure bending under its own weight in a way stone or iron would resist, but wood, by its nature, could not. Shipbuilders bolted iron straps through the hull just to keep them together. They were asking wood to do something wood cannot do, which means the question was never whether wood would reach its limit. It was only ever how far past it builders were willing to push, and what finally forced them to stop. Wood had a ceiling. Builders knew it, felt it in the iron straps they bolted through hulls just to keep the structure from folding under its own weight. And yet they kept building longer, kept pushing the material past what it could honestly do. Because the demand was there, the contracts were signed, and stopping meant admitting the whole enterprise had a limit. So they pushed. And then they had to launch what they'd built. Launching a ship of several thousand tons using nothing but grease, timber, and gravity was one of the most dangerous operations in 19th century engineering. The ship sat on a cradle of carefully angled timber, coated in tallow and soft soap, riding a slipway cut down to the water's edge. The math was brutal. Release the blocks at the wrong moment, let the grease set unevenly, miscalculate the angle, and something that had taken 3 years to build could stick, roll sideways, or plunge bow first into the riverbed in seconds. Several major launches in the 1850s did exactly that, in front of thousands of spectators who had turned out to watch history and instead watched catastrophe. Years of work, gone in the time it took to draw a breath. But when it worked, when something that size began to move for the first time, slow and then faster, the whole crowd going silent, there is no account from anyone who witnessed it that doesn't reach for the same word. Impossible. It looked impossible. Which raises the question, if wood itself was already failing, what kept builders from stopping? And what finally forced them to? That silence the crowd fell into, it wasn't just awe, it was the first hint that something with this many seams, this many fastened joints, this many tons of living wood, was about to meet the one force it had been built to survive: the ocean. Once launched, these ships went to work, and the work was brutal. The great clipper routes of the mid-19th century were not gentle passages. They were endurance tests dressed up as commerce. Tea from China, wool from Australia, gold seekers flooding toward California after 1849. All of it moved by sail, by wind, by the judgment of a captain reading watercolor and cloud shape at 2 in the morning. The fastest clipper ships made the Cape Horn run from New York to San Francisco in under 90 days. That route around the southern tip of South America, through some of the coldest, most violent water on Earth, was said to age a ship 5 years in a single passage. The seas there don't build gradually, they arrive. 40-foot swells hitting a wooden hull broadside, every plank working against every other, every caulked seam tested simultaneously. Which is the question that shadows everything built in those yards. A ship that survived a launch, survived her first Atlantic crossing, survived Cape Horn. How long could she actually last? The honest answer is, longer than anyone had a right to expect. A well-built wooden ship, one where the timber had been seasoned properly, the framing fitted tight, the caulking driven hard, could last 20 years in regular service. Some lasted 40. A few made it past 50 before the rot finally won. That durability wasn't luck. It was the accumulated judgment of men who had spent their entire lives learning what wood would do under pressure, in salt water, over time. And then iron came for all of it. Not fast. That's the part the history books tend to skip. Iron hulls had been possible since the 1820s, but wooden shipyards kept building through the 1850s, the 1860s, even into the 1870s. The transition was slow because the knowledge was slow to transfer. And in the end, for many of the men who held it, it didn't transfer at all. Many of the most skilled wooden shipwrights refused to work in iron entirely. 30 years of mastering a living material, one they could feel flex under a mallet, smell when it was starting to turn, hear when a joint was seated right. And iron told them nothing. It didn't breathe. It didn't speak. They walked away from the yards rather than become beginners again. Which means what they knew, they took with them. The judgment about which timber to choose, which curve to trust, how much give a hull needed to survive a sea that arrived all at once. That knowledge stopped being passed down the day those men stopped teaching it. What exactly was lost? In that silence is a question nobody thought to ask until it was too late to answer. What they took with them, mostly, was everything. The last great wooden shipbuilding yards closed through the 1880s and into the 1890s, and when they did, the half models hanging on the loft walls, the rule of thumb tables scratched into notebooks, the oral traditions passed from master to apprentice over decades, most of it simply ceased to exist. Not lost in a fire, not stolen, just not written down, not handed on, not considered worth preserving by a world that had already moved past it. A handful of things survived. Scattered half models in maritime museums, a few lofting diagrams. The ships themselves, the ones still afloat or dry docked, carry the knowledge inside them in the only form it could survive, built into their frames, their curves, the geometry of every joint. You can measure what those men knew, you cannot recover how they knew it. That is the real loss, not the ships themselves. Many rotted at anchor or were broken up for timber once iron hulls made them obsolete. A few survived by accident. The Charles W. Morgan, the last of the American wooden whalers, was already being used as a floating museum by 1916, saved less by reverence than by inertia. But she is the exception. The men who shaped her frames, who could read a timber's grain by touch and judge a hull's fairness by eye alone, left no manuals. What they knew lived in the hand, passed from shipwright to apprentice across decades of standing in the same yard, swinging the same tools. When the yards closed, the apprentices scattered. Within a single generation, the living chain snapped. The knowledge that built them never made it to shore.